Okay, we're at the top of the hour. This is Adrian Hernandez, the host for today's Collaboratory Grand Round. And today and next week, we have a what I call a mini summer series that's going to discuss issues about the approach towards Central IRBs. Pleased to have today Cynthia Hahn, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research, and she's going to present information regarding the advances of use of Central IRBs from a city project. So with that intro, let me turn it over to Cindy. Cindy, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Dr. Hernandez said, my name is Cynthia Hahn, and I work at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research in New York. And over the last couple of years, I've worked with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative on a series of projects looking at the use and adoption of Central IRBs for multi-center clinical trials here in the United States. And that's going to be the focus of my talk this afternoon. So just to kind of give you a little bit idea about what CITI is as an introduction for those who don't know. So the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is a public-private partnership that was co-founded by FDA and Duke in 2007, which involves all the stakeholders in the clinical trials process, so institutions, pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies, sponsors, organizations like that. We come together to identify and promote practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials across the enterprise in the United States. And obviously, institutional review boards are a critical and important part of the clinical trial landscape here in the U.S. And is an important part of the regulatory approval process, and yet can really be a difficult part in getting things up and running. And so we wanted to take a look at it and better understand policies and process and procedure around institutional review board review and approval. And you can see these are all of the organizations, the kinds of organizations that are involved in CITI. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different parts of the organization represented, parts of the ecosystem represented, and it really does represent a very fair, I think, and balanced process towards looking at these issues. So the first thing I wanted to do, and I feel like this slide is a really important slide when we start talking about Central IRBs. Central IRBs have actually existed for a very long time. The first U.S. independent IRB was actually in 1968 and predated the regulations that we think of today. And when you think about all of the different pieces, some people have a tendency to think, well, Central IRBs are something new. But when you really go back and look at all of the regulation and all of the guidance that's out there, you can kind of see that there's been information and Central IRBs have existed since the start. And then in the last couple of years, we have this, as we're all very familiar with, this sort of steady drumbeat of more information around how we can improve the process and how we can drive efficiency around this process. Everything from FDA guidance on IRB registration, adoption of the NCI Central IRB model, all the way through the most recent NIH draft guidance and the expected NPRM and the prior ANPRM revision to the Common Rule. So when we think about Central IRBs, there really has been a deep history here. It's not something relatively new. But what we recognized when we started thinking about these issues is that even though OHRP and the FDA have indicated that it is perfectly acceptable to utilize a Central IRB, that there was really varying degrees of use. So the rationale for it is that in a multi-center clinical trial, full review by each site's IRB may not necessarily enhance the protection of human subjects. And while the FDA, OHRP, and the Department of Health and Human Services support the use of Central IRBs for multi-center clinical trials, the adoption was not, very prevalent a number of years ago. And that brings us to the first CITI project that we did. So in 2010, we put together a project where the goal was to identify solutions to address the barriers to the adoption of Central IRBs for multi-center clinical trials. And the objectives there were really to solicit the perceptions of the barriers. So what did people think were the number one barriers towards adoption? Were they things like legal issues, administrative issues? Were people concerned about the regulations? Were people concerned about local context? So we solicited those perceptions. We then wanted to develop a strategy to address the identified barriers, and then once we developed that strategy, to then go out and assess the reaction to those proposed solutions to remove the barriers. And so we did that project from 2010 to 2013, and there were some common themes that resulted as a result of that project. The first one, which I don't think should surprise anybody, is the need to clarify terms. When you use the term Central IRB, or like the NIH draft policy uses, single IRB, it means many different things to many different people. And so you have to really define what the term means. And so for us, how we define the term for our project is that a Central IRB is a single IRB of record for a given project. And what that implies is that as an institution, if you don't agree to rely on the Central IRB, you don't do the project. So it's a single IRB per project. So that is our term of how we're defining Central IRB. And then the other thing we identified is that concerns associated with we're really concerned with the common practice of combining the responsibilities of the research institution with the ethical review responsibilities of the IRB. So anyone on the call that's from an institution or from an IRB office knows that when you submit your application to the IRB, you're very often asked to submit other things along with it, like your conflict of interest disclosure, or did you get your biomedical engineering approval, or did you get your radiation safety committee approval? And an IRB review, kind of in quotes, really becomes the funnel through which many organizations funnel what we'll call institutional approval. So there was this common practice of combining the responsibilities of the research institution with the ethical review responsibilities of the IRB. And finally, the third theme that became very prevalent was there was this remaining discomfort. And the discomfort was really due to lack of experience, so that organizations would very often say to us as we were walking through this project, you know, I'm not really opposed to the idea of a Central IRB review. I just don't really know how to do it. And so there was this, remaining discomfort, and that led to sort of this lack of trust question. So moving forward. So our first Central IRB project recommendations was the first thing we said is that we do believe, based on the data that we were able to gather, that using a Central IRB defined as a single IRB of record for all sites does improve the quality and efficiency of multi-center clinical trials. And in order to address the blurred distinctions between responsibilities for ethics review and other institutional obligations, CITI recommends that sites and IRBs use something that we developed, a CITI-developed guide we call the considerations document, to support communication and contractual responsibilities and relationships between institutions and a Central IRB. So this kind of goes through the things that are actually the responsibilities of an IRB versus what are the responsibilities of the institution. And finally, in order to address the question of experience and trust, sponsors in a position to require the use of Central IRB review for multi-site trial networks should do so in order for the relevant stakeholders to gain experience with Central IRB. So this was the idea that, we weren't 100% sure that individuals were actually going to voluntarily adopt this model, but that if sponsors required it, more individuals would therefore get more experience, and that would increase individuals' levels of trust with the new process. And so we published all of this. You can find the considerations document on the CITI website, which designates the responsibilities of the institution, the IRB, either and both. We also published this data in PLOS One. There were two publications that resulted from there were two publications that resulted from the first project. One was using Central IRBs for multi-center clinical trials in the United States, and that was in PLOS One, and that got to the question of what were the barriers and what are the solutions to the barriers. And then we also did a review of the literature, which was in clinical trials, use of central institutional review boards for multi-center clinical trials, which kind of goes through all of the literature around Central IRBs that had been conducted to date. When we got to the end of 2013, and anybody who participates in any CITI projects knows, or any project, we got to the end of 2013 and we realized we weren't really done. So we had identified what the barriers were, we had proposed some solutions, but we realized people still needed help. And really that came out of what I'm doing today. Webinars, seminars, presentations at Primer, AHARP, other organizations. We would go around and present the original Central IRB project, and we got back the same question. Even if I want to do this, I'm not exactly sure what I need to do. What do I need to do within my organization to actually do that? What are the tools and resources I need in order to actually implement Central IRB review, whether I'm a sponsor or an organization? I'm not exactly sure what has to happen. So we decided to embark on a second project, and this is called the City Central IRB Advancement Project. And this project began in 2013 and continued throughout this year. And this project really addresses the how-to. It gets to questions about what about local context. So that was something that comes up periodically in conversation, right? How does a Central IRB really understand what's happening at a site that may be hundreds or if not thousands of miles away? Is there an example IRB authorization agreement? So that's great that you guys can figure out what are the responsibilities of an institution versus an IRB. And people pretty much felt like the one-page OHRP 3-sentence thing wasn't enough. But then we also see these 27-page hyper-legalistic, you need, a law degree to review IRB authorization agreements. Is that too much? What do I need to do at my institution, internally, inside my institution? So now that's great. You tell me, okay, I can use a Central IRB. What body is empowered to do things like make a decision that study can get started? Who's going to ensure that the radiation safety office has signed off on this? Who's going to ensure that biomedical engineering has taken a look at this device? Those kinds of questions. And what are the right individuals, bodies, and organizations internally in an institution that need to get involved? So how do I select a Central IRB? How do I trust that IRB is going to do what I want that IRB to do? And I think in the wake of the Coast IRB sting, I think that was a very real concern for some organizations. And as a sponsor, can I really require my sites to do this? Are they all going to kind of run away and be like, we're just not going to do research with you? And these were, we thought, very real and very legitimate questions. So what did we do? Well, as I said, we held a bunch of webinars. We held webinars on sponsor perspectives and on research institution perspectives. So we wanted to get that information out there. We collected template IRB authorization agreements, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We held an expert meeting, and then we developed recommendations coming out of that meeting. So let me talk a little bit about the IRB authorization agreement. So as I said, one of the first concerns we heard from organizations was, even if I understand what my responsibilities are as an institution versus what my responsibilities are as an IRB, what does that IRB authorization agreement need to look like? And so we put a request out to the IRB listserv, to the IRB forum, and we said, for organizations that would be willing to participate, if you could send us your IRB authorization agreements. And we received 16 template IRB authorization agreements, or waivers. Some people call them waivers. We reviewed those to determine the kinds of clauses that were included and the frequency to which those clauses appeared. So if a clause was there, how many of the authorization agreements did that clause actually appear? And the kinds of IRBs and human research protection programs that responded, about 56% were institutional IRBs, 31% were commercial and independent IRBs, 30% were IRBs associated with a federal sponsor, and 30% were IRBs associated with a clinical trial network. And this equals more than 100 because different IRBs and human research protection programs may have filled more than one role. This was, I think, one of those things that if we were in a big group right now, everyone would be laughing if you could hear everybody. I don't think it's a big surprise. So when we looked at all of these different clauses, and I want to say I think there were 72 different clauses that appeared in all the agreements, so across all 16 agreements, these were the only clauses that were included in 100%, which meant that every single agreement included these clauses. These are the only things that were in every agreement. And they were the name of the reviewing IRB, the name of the institution, a general statement of reliance, scope of the agreement, and signatures. Everything else was different. And so you can see that there was clearly a need for organizations to come together and to say, okay, what are the things that really matter? What do we need to include in IRB authorization agreements? And can we agree on what those things need to say? So we held an expert meeting in June of 2014, so a year ago, where we got together with individuals who represented CROs, individuals from institutions, individuals from sponsors, individuals. There were OHRP was there, FDA was there. We got together in this expert meeting, and we discussed the examples of organizations who've adopted single IRB of record for multi-center clinical trials. We talked about local context, the challenges, and the operational models. So we talked about, what people were doing, how they were doing it, and what some best practices were. We took a look at the clauses in the IRB authorization agreement templates, and we obtained feedback to refine the proposed template. And the discussion led to the development of another document that we're calling the evaluation checklist. At the same time all of this was going on, so we had this meeting in June, and we got together, and now we had gone back to our desks, and we're all in our offices, refining our documents, refining the evaluation checklist, refining the IRB authorization agreement. The NIH came out with a draft policy that I'm sure all of you are familiar with in December of last year, use of a single IRB for multi-site research. And what the draft policy said was that use of a single IRB may lead to enhanced protections, may minimize institutional conflicts, may refocus IRB time and resources towards the review of other studies. And I think this is a really important point. I like this third bullet, and I like it for a couple of reasons. And that's because, anecdotally, within my own institution, I can tell you that when we moved towards the kind of full-on review allowance of taking the IRB review that comes with the study. So this isn't we went out and created a master relationship with a commercial IRB. This is we accept the review of the IRB that comes with the study. So it's a single IRB model. It did a couple of things for us. One is that it really did refocus our IRB on those projects that were homegrown. And as anybody who's on the call who is at an institutional IRB, you know that those very often are the studies that take the most time, right? They may not have undergone peer review yet, or if they have undergone peer review, they may not have necessarily taken into account all the human subject considerations that you need to take into account. Those are the studies that do take a lot more time. It also allowed us to redirect resources so that we could actually monitor the conduct of the study. So it enabled me to take into FTEs who were, prior to this, really processing applications and managing the IRB committee process, and actually have put those individuals out in the field to monitor the informed consent process, or to meet directly with investigators and research subjects to walk through very complex trial designs. And I think that, is probably, in many ways, a better way to protect human subjects than sitting in an office and sort of processing applications. And then regarding local context, the NIH said, the assessment of a study's risks and benefits and adequacy should not generally require the perspective of a local IRB. And that dovetails with what we have found is that many of the local context concerns are really legal concerns. There's things about, when you talk with individuals, they're really things like, oh, I need to better understand that the legal age of consent in this state is X as opposed to Y. And those kinds of concerns are the things that can be communicated to an IRB through a very good site assessment process that can be accomplished by the Central IRB or the single IRB of record, and doesn't necessarily mean that the local IRB needs to review. The draft policy proposes that NIH-funded institutions should be expected to use a single IRB of record for domestic sites unless there's a justification for an exception. So it goes along with our city recommendation that sponsors require use of Central IRB. And exceptions will be allowed only if the designated single IRB is unable to meet the needs of a specific population or where local IRB is required by federal, tribal, state laws, or regulations. What I really felt like was interesting, and this was something that we got very excited about on our city project, is we spent time, I guess because we're just a bunch of IRB geeks, we spent time reading all of the comments to the draft policy. And, it really fit fit in very nicely with our project. So Primer's comments were to develop tools, guidance, and best practices to help facilitate the use of single IRB review mechanisms. The AAMC said roles and responsibilities of all sites must be clearly and explicitly defined before institutions will be confident in the ability to cede or take on IRB review. We completely concur, and the considerations document does that. Institutions will need more guidance on how to choose a single IRB and when this decision needs to be made, and we'll talk a little bit about the evaluation checklist and how we think that can help. And guidance should clearly define the role and responsibilities of a single IRB of record and that of the institution with concrete suggestions for implementation, and that came from the Society for Clinical Research Sites. And again, we wholeheartedly concur and think that that's exactly where we are with the advancement project. So, which brings me to our recommendations, and our recommendations were just finalized this spring and were released at ACRP, the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, back in April, and are posted on the city website. And our recommendation number one was that we recommend the use of our city-developed evaluation checklist for institution sponsors and organizations serving as a central IRB. And the evaluation checklist really gets into three areas. So it asks a series of questions around, are you considering adoption of a central IRB model for multi-center clinical trials? And then it goes through an institutional self-evaluation. So it asks, it says, okay, institution, these are the things you should consider before you decide to adopt a central IRB model. These are the kinds of things you need to think about. It gives the pathway. It doesn't say what you have to do, because there's lots of different ways that that would meet the requirements, but these are the kinds of things you need to think about before doing it. Have you decided to use a central IRB for multi-center clinical trials? So this is at the point that you have actually made the decision that, yes, in fact, I've done my institutional self-evaluation, and yes, I believe I'm ready to use a central IRB. This then is a general consideration for institutions and sponsors when selecting a particular IRB. So what do you need to know about that IRB before you agree to rely on that particular IRB? What are the questions and what are the things you should be asking? And then finally, are you serving as the central IRB? So remember, the NIH guidance, and in fact our city recommendations as well, don't say we have to use a commercial IRB or the NCI IRB or a government IRB or any specific IRB. All of those IRBs may serve as a single IRB of record, including an institutional IRB, so another institution's IRB of record. So if you are serving as the central IRB, to take on the liability and the risk for reviewing for that institution. So what are some of the things you need to consider there? So the first is, do I even want to do this? And then, yes, I want to. And what do I need to think about as an institution about the IRB? And then if I'm serving as a central IRB, what do I need to know about my institutions? The second recommendation is to address the administrative and legal concerns and to reduce the time when first executing a reliance agreement. We recommend that institutions and IRBs adopt or begin negotiations with our IRB authorization agreement template, which represents a consensus document of all of the organizations and individuals that were at our June expert meeting. And I think this is an important part of the recommendation. For those of you who may have seen Dan Nelson's talk about the work that he did at UNC around adoption of central IRB models there, one of the efficiencies that individuals like to point out is that use of a central IRB may reduce time to study startup. And that's true if you have already negotiated a contract. When you add in the time it takes to negotiate an IRB authorization agreement, very often that may sort of take the replace of the time that it may have taken to actually coordinate multiple local IRB reviews. And so to reduce sort of that time to execution, we recommend use of a, kind of a global IRB authorization agreement template that multiple organizations, individuals, and sponsors can agree to. We think that's an important step. And so we did develop a template IRB authorization agreement. Again, it is available on the city website. You can download that document. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't contain, all of the sort of legal bells and whistles, and there are sections that are are more legalistic than others, and sections that we feel are required sections, and sections that are more optional. So, for example, if you are developing an IRB office, we wanted this to be used by as many people as possible. So we had, for example, the HIPAA section is optional. So if you're not a covered entity, you wouldn't necessarily need to include language about HIPAA, but if you are a covered entity, you would. So those kinds of things, may be optional. And in the third recommendation, because this question of local context kept coming up, and we kept bumping into the fact that SACRP in January of 2013 did in fact publish guidance on this issue on considerations of local context with respect to increasing use of single IRB review. And at the expert meeting, we really didn't have anything to add to that. SACRP did a very good job, we thought, of addressing this issue, and so our recommendation is to follow the Secretary Advisory's Committee on Human Resource Protection recommendations on considering local context. Finally, our recommendations 4 and 5, and this becomes a very significant question. And that question is, how do we define quality in IRB review? So we can define things like efficiency and turnaround times, and we can define whether people have good standard operating procedures and are they following the regulations, and you can look at people's individual sites' regulatory history. But how do you define quality, and how do you address elements of trust? And that is is still, I think, a significant question when we think about reliance. The absence of a negative event does not necessarily define a quality program. And so just because someone hasn't had a problem doesn't mean that they have a quality program. And so that doesn't serve as a good surrogate. And we know that. We really struggled with that. We also recommend that research be conducted to develop data and technology standards across electronic IRB application systems. So the other issue that comes up, and this definitely will come up if you're at an institution, it comes up really frequently at my institution, is your investigators, when utilizing multiple central IRBs, have multiple systems to work with. So submitting the IRB application, I'm sure we all have these educational programs that say, oh, hi, come meet the IRB and learn how to submit your application. It's a little bit different now, right? If they're submitting to Western IRB and the NCI IRB and your local institutional IRB and, Neuronext IRB and StrokeNet and all these groups all have their own systems. And so your investigators really become kind of these jack of all trades of kind of being able to submit to multiple systems. So we would like to see some technology standards developed across IRB application systems to facilitate communication in some more efficacious and transparent process. So these are the tools that we developed, as we talked about. There's the self-evaluation tool, there's the evaluating an institution, and then evaluating the central IRB process. And again, all this stuff is on the city website. I'd like to thank our Central IRB advancement team. Besides myself, Petra Kaufman from NIH and Sue Bang from Celgene, as I talked about before, City are these collaborative projects that bring together stakeholders from multiple parts of the ecosystem. So in this case, we have a industry, institution, and federal. Our city project manager, Sarah Calvert, who's been amazing, and my team members, and you can see we represent a pretty wide group, including patient representatives and advocacy organizations, kind of looking at the project. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. I understand that, the way this works with you guys is a kind of question and answer period, and I would be happy to talk about anything in my presentation, as well as any questions you have about central IRBs and where we're going from here. And I will pass it back to Gloria.
Thanks, Cindy. This is great. And there are over 200 people here on this grand round, so I know there's intense interest here. Let me open it up with Mike Lauer first. And actually, I have a question for him, and I think he probably has a couple of questions. But it'd be very interesting to hear, Mike, from your perspective at HLBI, where you have you're sponsoring multiple studies and multiple trials. Where does this fit in for your institution's interest? And then I'd like to hear your questions for Cindy.
Thanks, Adrian. And first of all, I just want to say that was a terrific presentation. And now I'll admit a bit of a conflict of interest. I'm on the CTTI Executive Committee or Executive Board. But this is really great work, and it's extraordinarily important. And I think that you and your colleagues have taken some important steps towards making a cultural central IRB and single IRB more of the norm rather than the exception. This is something that's very important to us, and actually we hosted a workshop a number of years ago on central IRB and single IRBs. And the reason why this is important is because one of the big issues in our ability to fund trials are delays, and particularly startup delays. And there certainly is an impression that work involving multiple IRBs results in delays with startup as well as delays in execution. Every time that, for example, an amendment goes through, if an amendment has to be approved by multiple IRBs before it's fully active for an entire study, that creates additional delays that to be a waste. So this is something of great interest to us, and we were very happy about the NIH draft policy. So I had a couple of questions. One question was, I spent 14 years working on an IRB at Cleveland Clinic. It was one of the busiest IRBs in the country, and I remember that when the cancer group went to Central IRB, we got all nervous about a loss of control. There's a general sense that we know things better, and that this is potentially dangerous, that we were giving away control over IRB review to someone on the outside. In the end, of course, it all turned out just fine. But I'm wondering whether this was something that you heard from anyone, that this kind of a sense of loss of control and a sense of, you called it lack of expertise, but I don't know whether I would even take it a step further. Even if they have the expertise, we don't trust them anyway.
Yeah, so we definitely heard this. In the first project, one of the things we did is we went around and we interviewed 6 institutions where they just were absolutely not using Central IRB, where they had taken a stand that they just weren't going to do it. And we did a very deep dive into those institutions. So we interviewed investigators, we interviewed IRB members, we interviewed IRB chairs, we interviewed legal counsel, we interviewed the dean, the provost, we interviewed everybody involved in the central business offices to try to understand, was it a cultural thing? Like what was really going on within those institutions? And we did get exactly those comments. I think the most common prevalent idea was, there were 2 actually. One was, if it's not broken, why fix it? So there was definitely in those organizations and in those institutions an idea that they didn't see the problem. So they couldn't see why anybody wanted to move to Central IRB review. And the second one was, we do it better than anybody else. So they were absolutely convinced that they did it better than everybody else. And so I said, okay, and we thought this was a really interesting question because it gets to this question of quality. So why do you think you do it better than everybody else? What is it about your organization, what you do, that is better than everyone else? And people had a really hard time putting their finger on it. They said, well, we just do. We're just better. They really did. They had a very hard time defining this quality question. And a lot of them said, well, we just have never had a problem. We've never had a problem, so we must be doing it better because this guy and this guy and this guy have been cited and we haven't. And, and we said, well, that's not really, the absence of an issue isn't necessarily a sign of quality. But yeah, we definitely heard it across the organizations. But what was really, really interesting was we said, to kind of flip the question around, we would end the interviews by saying, so you do it really well. And you guys obviously have a very good program and you feel very confident in your ability. So if you were asked to be a Central IRB, would you?
Yeah.
Most organizations couldn't, couldn't commit. They said, well, I don't know. I don't know that I don't know. I'm not sure. So it was interesting because they were so confident until you asked. They said, okay, well, if we were to do away with IRBs everywhere and to say, okay, we're going to set up a regional IRB and you are in this region and, would you agree to be the regional IRB? They were like, oh, yeah, no. So it's just an interesting situation.
I have to say that's fascinating, and having been there myself, when I was on the Cleveland Clinic IRB, I totally get that, and we certainly did not see the problem, and maybe that's one of the advantages of being both there as well as now here at NIH, where we certainly definitely do see the problem, because we're looking at it from a different vantage point. So that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Great. So one question I have, Cindy, and also I ask that we unmute Jeremy Sugarman here, is that often when we hear about central IRBs, the notion of simplicity is heavily emphasized. And one of the issues that has come up as we've talked about this in other settings is considerations of different study types and the spectrum of risk of patients and or studies. So really, one would like to hear some comments from Jeremy about any of the ethics intersections here for central IRB, and then also Cindy, hear if any of those issues came up with this review of the landscape and approach. Jeremy, you want to start?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So great presentation, and it's nice to hear all this work summarized so clearly. One of the issues I wanted to just raise before I dive into Adrian's question is we're in the clinical trials business because we do clinical trials to provide an answer based on data. And many years ago, we realized the same thing was true with ethics and regulatory apparatus. It's always surprising to me when we promulgate policies or procedures in ethics or in clinical trial design without data about safety or efficacy. And what I'm wondering about in this case is you've heard lots of concerns from stakeholders about the need to, first of all, adopt a more efficient system, which central IRBs would be, seems to be a very promising mechanism for doing so. We're all frustrated by having multiple IRBs review things, especially things that are arguably very minor and almost trivial. But on the other hand, there are other sets of protections. So while the IRB system is moving in this direction, these institutional protections, the web of protections, the need to move to a human research subjects protection system, which is far more robust than what the IRB is charged to do. We don't really have any information not only about the quality of review, but the true costs of mounting the system. So while you may save IRB costs, the true costs of implementing a standard may be just cost shifting and pushing burden elsewhere. So I'm wondering what, if any, concerns are raised about the obligation, and I'd say actually an ethical obligation, to gather data and to do demonstration projects before pushing forward one single approach to solve this review problem. And I'll just segue then to Adrian's question, which is really a critical one. If we were doing a multi-center survey research, which posed minimal risk and it wasn't on something socially stigmatizing, we can clearly see that we need a truncated model for doing IRB review. But if we have something that's an extraordinarily high-risk situation with institutions of varying ability to deal with issues of risk, from an ethical matter and our primary obligation to minimize risks to potential research participants and also ensure their consent, how will you accommodate that in this model, and what approaches ought a central IRB be using to ensure that the participants are appropriately protected?
So this is Cindy. In answering the first part of your question around the question about human research protection programs versus, IRB review, I concur with everything you said. I think, and it did come up. Are we just shifting responsibility or shifting burdens or using different words and therefore not really building in efficiencies, but also what is the true cost and what does that look like, and what does an actual robust quality human research protection program look like regardless of IRB utilized. And I think that's, research that is really important and research that has to be done. And I agree with you that we should not be making policy and significant changes that are going to affect the, environment for the conduct of clinical trials without having adequate data to support what that needs to look like. And I do think there needs to be much more research done in this area. And so, I applaud NIH for their most recent, RFP or RFA out on, studying this question. But I agree with you. I think a lot more research needs to be done in this space, and I think that we need. Now that said, the ecosystem has changed dramatically. I mean, we all know the whole, no more single sites, everything's multi-site, and it's much more complex, and the environment we work with is much more complex. And when we get to that question, we even need to think about the fact that we're not just talking about U.S.-based clinical trials, right? I mean, with very few exceptions, even my investigator-initiated stuff is international and multinational. And so, this question of what does that look like? I think we also need to be more broad and think not just, U.S.-based, but also internationally, what are we doing? Because with very few exceptions, a lot of the research that we're looking at is not just, U.S.-based or even regional or single institutions. So I think there's definitely much more research that needs to happen in that environment. I think in regards to your question about minimal risk, are you sort of getting at the question of what actually needs IRB review and if there are alternative models of ethical review?
I think it's sort of, if you're thinking about what studies might be most appropriate to be reviewed by a central IRB versus a local IRB, I'm just wondering whether the question of risk plays a role in that.
So I think for some people it has. I know that just in speaking with various organizations and collecting their SOPs and their template agreements and things like that, there are institutions who feel that the level of risk should be one of the considerations that's taken into account. So on a project-by-project basis, understanding the level of risk. But then there are others who feel very strongly that the definition of minimal risk, because it's not as clearly defined as perhaps it could be in certain populations, that they feel strongly like that is a local context issue. And so making like a broad statement, sort of like we're only going to allow things that are minimal risk to be reviewed by central IRBs, or we're never going to allow things that are minimal risk, which I think is a difficult proposition for most people. Most people sort of think of it as this question of what is indeed minimal risk. Seems to be something that I think it gets very tied up in the question of local context.
Yeah. I think the context here is that at some point someone an institution will have to say, okay, for this trial, can we go ahead and use a central IRB, or if there are mandates, for example, from NIH, for instance, for having systems like this, again, understanding what's there is a tension there in terms of what needs local review versus central, and then even in that context, evaluating that becomes in itself a process. Let's turn to Carolyn, who raises an interesting question about commercial IRBs, and one thing that has come up related to this is there's actually some interesting dynamics here in that. In one way, all the interest in terms of nationalizing IRBs or the approach to IRB, in part helps change the market such that you could actually have a monopoly or only a couple that are doing that. And then there are some challenges with that, that being either a monopoly versus a public utility. But right now, some of these pressures certainly enhance the ability for commercial IRBs to grow. And looks like Carolyn's comments are about how to evaluate that quality. But Carolyn, you want to go ahead? Do we have her unmuted?
Yes, I think the question that I asked was really to set a framework for putting everything on this sort of the same level platform. How do we, evaluate both commercial and NCI Central IRB to engage at the same level? And I wondered if that came into your consideration and what points you'd like to add that would help frame that evaluation.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, it definitely came into our considerations. A lot of individuals asked, which is why I made the point to say that any entity could serve as a central IRB. So I think, when we first started doing the original project and we used the word central IRB, we realized very quickly that people thought we were talking about commercial IRBs, right? So that was the first thing. People would say, oh, well, yeah, we don't allow use of commercial IRBs or whatever. So we said, no, even if it wasn't a commercial IRB, so that was kind of point one. But then we sort of started looking more into that question because we realized that the commercial IRB community, and for some people, it seems to create kind of this knee-jerk reaction of no. And for other people, it's like, well, they feel much more comfortable. They've used them. They're sort of comfortable with it. And I don't want to speak necessarily for my central IRB colleagues, but what it can definitely say is that what you have to consider, whether it's a commercial IRB, institutional IRB, or a federal IRB, doesn't differ. From an institutional perspective, you should be asking the same questions, right? You should be asking things like who's on the committee and what their expertise is. How do they manage conflicts of interest? How are they funded? Do they have the right resources to be able to conduct the study? Do they care about your site, right? So one of the things that we noted when we were kind of going out, just again, this is an institutional perspective, but when we would go out and speak with the central IRBs, the central IRBs were more than welcomed our input. So, it's sort of like as little and as much input as you want, they'll take from you. So you can tell them like 100 things about your institution, and they'll take those things into consideration in their review. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
No, I think that's helpful. And I just wondered how it would enter into this kind of workflow, looking with, the city central IRB. Yeah.
So the way it works into it is in the evaluation checklist. So when you decide which central IRBs you would utilize, part of that is the conversation and negotiations you have with that central IRB. So when you're talking with a central IRB and entering into your IRB authorization agreement, the IRB authorization agreement is just one of many documents that should be flowing back and forth between you and the central IRB. So the central IRB, for example, you guys should work out a plan for who's going to do notification in the event of an unanticipated problem or serious adverse event. Are you going to do joint notifications? Are you going to send in one letter? Is it two letters? Is it that you get to review their letter, they get to review your letter? I mean, there's a lot of detail that has to go into building these relationships. So that's what I'm saying. Thinking through the standard operating procedures and how you do those things is really important. And you really should see the central IRB as your partner, just like you see your IRB today, right? So your IRB and your institution are partners in this process for human resource protection. A central IRB is just another partner so that you as an institution can ensure that you are meeting your responsibilities for human resource protection.
Great. Let's next turn to Gordon Bernard. Gordon, you've been thinking about these issues for a very long time, and be good to hear your comments and perspectives here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. One, it seems to me that the driving force from the beginning of all of this was to, at the very least, eliminate duplicate reviews, hopefully duplicate redundant applications by lots of PIs and all the back and forth that goes with that, and then hopefully streamline in the process handling all that. And I just wonder, given the huge installed base of human protection programs at institutions like yours in Vanderbilt and elsewhere that agreeably are not IRB regulatory items, but they are part and parcel of protecting human subjects, that did Citi consider any other approaches to that streamlining process I mentioned at the beginning, eliminating duplicate reviews, other than Central IRBs? Is there another way to have a single review, but then use the infrastructure is already in place to handle all the rest?
So do you mean developing systems? So do you mean developing systems in addition to Central IRB review?
Well, no, I'm thinking we'll be talking next week about IRB Share, which is one way to eliminate duplicate reviews and duplicate applications, or simplify that process, and still have local oversight maintained by local IRBs, which addresses a lot of the trust issues. And I agree with you, the trust issues need to go away. I mean, we need to trust each other. I'm not there, but there are so many local systems already developed that are in place and working well. That is there a way to just simply have single reviews? And that way we don't have to have 50 reviews. We have one review, and then when there's an amendment, it's one review, and then use the rest of the system as it exists.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if Emily's on the call from the Vanderbilt group, but yeah. So they were there at the expert meeting, and we did consider other types of reviews. But very early on, we decided that the facilitated review process, which was the old NCI model, and the shared model, were not models that we in Citi were going to recommend. I mean, we decided that as part of the initial project because we didn't see the same efficiencies being built into that process. So if you go back to the original project, the one that was done in 2010 and ended in 2013, the recommendation there is that Citi recommends use of a single IRB of record, which, as I said in the beginning, would be if you don't agree to use that review, you don't do the study, which is the NeuroNext model, which is the idea that for those individuals who participate in NeuroNext, right, you utilize the NeuroNext IRB. You had to agree when you joined the grant before even knowing who the IRB was going to be. We didn't know at the time it was going to be partners. We just knew somebody was going to get the contract to be the Central IRB, but we all had to agree to even go in. We all had to agree that we were going to do this. And that was kind of, that's the Citi recommendation.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Next, let's open up Karen's line and talks as a commenting question about perspective, and actually relate to that. Cindy, maybe I know this was the recommendations from Citi were posted a few months ago. I'll be curious to hear what you've heard about the implementation of that. So, Karen, let's hear your comments and questions. Hello? Well, let me read it out to you. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, let's just summarize. So the comment was essentially about kind of really next steps. At the expert meeting, there was a lot of discussion about the barriers. So for the next phase, or is there a next phase in terms of trying to implement them? And then related to that, my question is about what has there been any kind of early response? What's the early signal from the community out there from the posting here.
Yeah, the information that we've gotten to date, the feedback that we've gotten so far has been generally pretty positive, because I think, I think someone, when we kind of kicked off this call and we kicked off the question and answer, and mentioned that, a lot of the work around this issue is really cultural, right? So when we started this project 5 years ago, there were not a lot of organizations that were as comfortable with use of central IRBs. They may have done 1 or 2 projects. Now, for example, I went to the AHARP conference a couple of weeks ago, and, back in May, and there was a session, I think every hour, one of the sessions had to do with central IRBs, right? So there's much more uptake in the community, and I think the culture has shifted in that direction. I think the area of remaining concern remains this question of quality. So how do we define quality in an IRB review system? How do we define quality in a human research protection program? What does that look like? How do we measure it? What are the metrics for that? Are there metrics? Are there surrogates? Are there things we can look at to say, this is a quality IRB, I know I can trust it, I know that I can trust this program, and as a sponsor's perspective, this is a quality human research protection program. I know that if I place my study here, if I cite my study at this institution, if I collaborate with this site and this scientist, then I know that what I'm getting is, good data, that patients are protected, that everything's working the way it's supposed to, regardless of IRB utilized. And I think that's the remaining question, and it's a difficult question to get to. It's not. There's no easy answer to this, and I think even defining quality, I think that's a difficult question in and of itself.
That's always sometimes a challenge in the eye of the beholder as well. So let me, for that last comment question, let's open Gordon's line. You have a follow-up comment, and then we'll talk about the next week's grand rounds. Gordon?
Yes, my question was, how do we organize the system if we go to central IRBs for most work that's multicenter in a way that is not overwhelmingly confusing, say, to institutions who have to work with perhaps dozens of central IRBs, each doing things differently, perhaps with different agreements, and then the investigators, which was touched upon earlier, I think, by Jeremy, having to interact with multiple IRBs and their rules and processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge question. For example, on Monday, I'm going to work with, we're having a meeting with, actually with Alan Green and his team in the IRB Rely group to try to somehow merge our city agreement with the agreement coming out of IRB Rely, right? And Emily from your group has been giving us feedback, and we've been working collaboratively. And I think that is really critical and really important. I think as a community, as a human research protection program community, we need to come together around these issues, and we need to say, okay, what makes sense? What doesn't make sense? Are there places where we can come together to eliminate the confusion? Like, let's take the confusion out of the process, and let's help move this forward. We know it's coming, so let's do it in a way that makes sense, and let's do it in a way that, the 80-20 rule, right? There's always going to be something a little bit different, but let's try to come up with some guidelines to structure that makes sense for everyone. And as I said, one of the recommendations coming out of the city project is to have more research done around this issue of centralized concepts, tools, verbiage, language for IRB electronic submission systems, so that people aren't constantly recreating. It'd be great if we could have like one portal, so everybody just could go log into ERA or something and upload your IRB documents. But we're not there yet.
Great, thank you. Perfect.
Well, that is a nice plug for next week. So we will be continuing this discussion with this special series. And here next week, we plan to hear in the context of different models for IRB and also in the context of the approach from CTSA and the ideas in PCORnet. So with that, I want to thank Cindy for an excellent presentation. This is really of great national importance, and we'll also want to hear how it's implemented in future grand rounds. So again, thank you for joining today, and thanks especially Cindy. All right, everyone, have a great weekend. See you next week.